October 24th, 1944. 0347 hours. Taiwan Strait. The USS Tang cuts through black water like a blade through silk. Her diesel engines purring in the darkness. Commander Richard Hetherington O'Kane stands in the conning tower, binoculars pressed against his face, scanning the horizon for the telltale silhouettes of Japanese merchant vessels. At 34 years old, O'Kane is already a legend, the most lethal submarine commander in the Pacific, with 24 confirmed kills. His crew calls him Dick, but the Japanese have another name for him, Akuma the Demon. Tonight, they're hunting in what submariners call the shooting gallery, the shallow, treacherous waters between Formosa, Summa, and mainland China, where Japanese convoys run supplies to their crumbling empire. It's dangerous water, barely 200 feet deep in places, with rocky shelves that can tear a submarine's hull open like paper. But O'Kane doesn't believe in safe hunting grounds. He believes in getting close, making every torpedo count, and getting his men home. Contact bearing 340 calls Floyd Caverly from the radar station below. Multiple targets. Looks like a convoy. O'Kane's jaw tightens. This is what they came for. The Tang is a Palau-class submarine. 311 feet of welded steel and compressed fury, armed with 24 Mark 18 electric torpedoes. She's been at sea for 53 days, and this is their 5th patrol. They've already sent 10 Japanese ships to the bottom on this run alone. O'Kane intends to add to that tally before heading back to Pearl Harbor. Battle stations torpedo. O'Kane orders, his voice calm, almost conversational. Throughout the submarine, men spring into practiced motion. In the forward torpedo room, Chief Torpedoman's mate Bill Leibold and his team stand ready beside 6 loaded tubes. In the maneuvering room, aft, electricians monitor the massive battery banks that will power their attack. The Tang's complement of 87 officers and men have trained together for months. They trust O'Kane completely, even when he takes them into situations that seem suicidal. The convoy materializes through O'Kane's binoculars 2 large transport ships, possibly 10,000 tons each, escorted by at least 3 destroyers. The destroyers are the problem. Japanese destroyer captains have gotten wise to American submarine tactics, and they're aggressive hunters. O'Kane has seen too many boats go down because their skippers got careless around escorts. But O'Kane isn't careless. He's methodical, calculating, and willing to take his boat places other commanders won't go. He learned his trade under the legendary Dudley Mush Morton aboard the USS Wahoo, where he served as executive officer during some of the most daring patrols of the war. Morton taught him that aggression wins battles, that you close to point-blank range and make your shots count. Morton is dead now. Wahoo went down with all hands in the La Perouse Strait 13 months ago, but his lessons live on in O'Kane. Range to lead transport, O'Kane asks. 4,000 yards in closing, sir, responds Lieutenant Lawrence Savadkin, the executive officer. O'Kane does the mathematics in his head. The convoy is making 12 knots, zigging on a predictable pattern to throw off submarine attacks. The destroyers are spread in a screen ahead and on the flanks. Standard doctrine says to stay at range, fire a spread of torpedoes, and dive deep. But O'Kane has never been standard. He's going to take them in close inside 1000 yards, if possible, where every torpedo becomes a near certainty. Come left to course 270, all ahead 1/3. Make your depth 6-5 feet. The Tang angles toward the convoy at periscope depth, her electric motors whispering. Through the periscope, O'Kane watches the targets grow larger. The lead transport is a beautiful target fully loaded, probably carrying troops or munitions to reinforce the Philippines. He can almost see the individual portholes along her hull. Flood tubes 1 through 6, O'Kane says quietly. Solution ready. Solution ready. Captain, confirms the torpedo data computer operator. Bearing mark, 285, sir. Range mark, 1200 yards, 1200 yards. Close enough to hit with a thrown rock in submarine terms. O'Kane watches the transport's bow cross his reticle. He's fired 178 torpedoes in combat, and he knows the precise moment when geometry, speed, and fate align. Fire 1. A shudder runs through the Tang as compressed air launches the first torpedo. Fire 2. Another shudder. Fire 3. 3. Mark 18 torpedoes streak toward the transport at 46 knots, their electric motors leaving no telltale wake of bubbles. O'Kane counts in his head 30 seconds, 45 seconds. The first explosion lights up the night like a magnesium flare. The transport's amidship section erupts in orange flame. The second torpedo hits her stern. The third strikes just forward of the bridge. In less than 3 minutes, 10,000 tons of Japanese shipping is sinking. But O'Kane doesn't celebrate. He's already looking at the second transport, already calculating the next shot. And he's noticed something that makes his blood run cold. The destroyers have turned toward them. They've been spotted. Take her down, O'Kane orders. Make your depth 200 feet. Rig for depth charge. Rig for silent running. The Tang noses down into the dark water, and every man aboard knows what's coming. October 24th, 1944. 0412 hours. 180 feet beneath the Taiwan Strait. The first depth charge detonates 300 yards astern, and the USS Tang bucks like a mule kicked in the ribs. Light bulbs shatter. Cork insulation rains down from the overhead. In the forward torpedo room, Chief Liebold grabs a stanchion to keep from being thrown against the tubes. The sound is beyond description, a metallic wham that feels like being inside a bell when it's struck, followed by a grinding roar as a pressure wave passes over the hull. O'Kane stands in the conning tower, one hand on the periscope housing, his face expressionless. He's been depth charged before 7 times on previous patrols, but it never gets easier. Each explosion is a reminder that you're trapped in a steel cylinder 200 feet underwater, while someone above is trying very hard to crack that cylinder open and drown you. Right full rudder, O'Kane says calmly. All ahead 1/3. Make your depth 250 feet. The Tang turns hard to starboard and continues diving. Japanese destroyers typically set their depth charges for 150 to 200 feet, the depth where American submarines usually try to hide. O'Kane is taking them deeper, into the thermocline, a layer of colder water that sometimes deflects sonar pings. It's a gamble. The Palau-class submarines have a test depth of 400 feet, meaning that's the deepest the Navy has officially tested them. Beyond that, the pressure becomes astronomical. At 600 feet, the sea exerts roughly 260 pounds per square inch on every inch of the hull. At 800 feet, that pressure doubles. Wham! Another depth charge, closer this time. The lights flicker. In the control room, electrician's mate Jesse Da Silva watches the depth gauge needle creep past 250 feet. Sweat drips from his forehead despite the 50-degree temperature. The air is already starting to taste stale, too much carbon dioxide, not enough oxygen. When you're running silent, you can't run the air scrubbers or the ventilation fans. Every system that makes noise is shut down. You sit in the dark, breathing carefully, and wait. Lieutenant Savadkin appears at O'Kane's elbow. "Skipper, we're at 260 feet. Recommend we level off." O'Kane shakes his head. "They know we're here, Larry. They're working a pattern. If we stay at this depth, they'll bracket us eventually. Take her to 300. Savadkin's eyes widen slightly, but he relays the order. The Tang continues her descent. At 300 feet, you can hear the hull itself protesting tiny creaks and groans as the steel compresses under the pressure. It sounds like the submarine is alive and in pain. Wham, wham. 2 depth charges in rapid succession. Close enough that the lights go out completely. Emergency battle lanterns cast everything in red shadows. In the maneuvering room, motor machinist Clayton Decker feels the deck plates vibrate beneath his feet. He's 22 years old, from Iowa, and he's never been more terrified in his life. But he stays at his post, hands on the motor controls, waiting for orders. Destroyer passing overhead. Reports the sound operator, radio man Floyd Caverly. He's wearing headphones connected to the submarine's passive sonar, listening to the thrum of propeller screws cutting through the water above. Twin screws, making turns for 15 knots. He's stopping, Captain. Everyone in the conning tower knows what that means. The destroyer has stopped to listen, using its own sonar to pinpoint the Tang's exact location. Once they have a fix, they'll drop a full pattern of depth charges, 6 or 8 explosives timed to detonate at different depths, creating a 3-dimensional cage of destruction. Steady as she goes, O'Kane murmurs, "Not a sound." The Tang glides through the darkness at bare steerage way, making perhaps 2 knots. In the crew's quarters, men lie in their bunks, not moving, barely breathing. Some pray. Some think about their families in California or Texas or Maine. Some simply stare at the bulkhead inches from their faces and try not to imagine what 300 feet of water pressure would do to a human body if the hull cracked. O'Kane knows the statistics. Of the 288 submarines the U.S. Navy has sent into combat, 52 have been lost. 1 in 5 boats never comes home. He knows the names Sculpin, Wahoo, Grunion, Trigger, Albacore. He knows that submariners have the highest casualty rate of any branch of the U.S., military 22%. He knows that if the Tang goes down here, in the Taiwan Strait, there will be no survivors. There never are. But O'Kane also knows his boat. He knows that the Balau-class submarines were over-engineered, built with thicker hulls than the Navy specs required because the contractors at Mare Island Naval Shipyard didn't trust the minimum standards. He knows that Tang was launched in August 1943, one of the newer boats, with welding techniques that were better than the early war construction. And he knows that sometimes the only way to survive is to do something the enemy thinks is impossible. Wham, 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 wham. 4 depth charges in a perfect square pattern, and the Tang is somewhere in the middle of that square. The submarine lurches violently. A pressure gauge on the bulkhead cracks. In the forward battery compartment, beneath the crew's quarters, torpedo man Hayes Trucka smells something acrid. Battery acid. One of the massive lead-acid batteries, each weighing more than a ton, has cracked, and seawater is leaking into the battery well. Chlorine gas in the forward battery, someone shouts. This is every submariner's nightmare. When seawater mixes with battery acid, It produces chlorine gas, the same stuff the Germans used in World War I to choke soldiers to death in the trenches. In an enclosed submarine, chlorine gas can kill everyone aboard in minutes. Secure the forward battery. O'Kane orders. Rig the auxiliary power from the after battery. Engineering. Give me a damage report. The reports come in: minor flooding in the pump room. Cracked pressure gauge. Chlorine gas contained but present. The Tang can still fight, but she's wounded. And the Japanese destroyers above know they've scored hits. They'll keep coming. O'Kane makes a decision that will either save his crew or kill them all. Make your depth 400 feet, he says quietly. Savatkin stares at him. Sir, that's test depth. We've never been that deep. I know, Larry, but those destroyers up there think we can't go deeper than 300. They're setting their charges accordingly. At 400 feet, we might slip beneath their pattern. Or the hull might implode. O'Kane meets his executive officer's eyes. Yes, he says. It might. But if we stay at 300, we're dead for certain. At least this way, we have a chance. Throughout the submarine, men hold their breath as the depth gauge needle creeps past 350 feet. 375 feet. 400 feet. October 24th, 1944. 0438 hours. 400 feet beneath the Taiwan Strait. At 400 feet, the USS Tang enters a realm no American submarine has willingly explored in combat. The pressure outside the hull is now 173 pounds per square inch, more than 11 times normal atmospheric pressure. For every square foot of the submarine's surface, nearly 25,000 pounds of force presses inward. The rivets holding the hull plates together begin to weep tiny streams of water. The deck plates groan and pop. In the torpedo rooms, the massive bronze tubes actually compress, their circumference shrinking by fractions of an inch. O'Kane watches the depth gauge, as if hypnotized. The needle quivers at 400 feet, then slides past it. 410 feet. 420 feet. The submarine is still descending, her momentum carrying her deeper, even though the dive planes are neutral. In the control room, chief of the boat. William Ballinger works the trim manifold, trying to achieve neutral buoyancy without making noise that might give away their position. Ping. The sound is unmistakable active sonar from the destroyer above. The high-pitched pulse echoes through the Tang's hull, and every man aboard knows what it means. The Japanese have them on their screens. They're getting a firing solution. 425 feet, sir, calls the diving officer, his voice tight. O'Kane nods slowly. They're 25 feet beyond test depth now, deeper than the designers at Mare Island ever intended this submarine to go. But they're still alive, and the hull is holding. The real question is whether they can stay alive for the next few minutes. Level off at 425. O'Kane orders. Dead slow, not a sound. Overhead, they hear it, the sound every submariner dreads. The heavy thrum, thrum, thrum of destroyer screws accelerating. The Japanese captain is making his run, positioning his ship directly above the Tang's location. In perhaps 30 seconds, he'll release his depth charges, and they'll sink toward the submarine like mechanical sharks. In the forward torpedo room, Chief Liebold catches the eye of torpedoman's mate Sidney Jones. Neither man speaks, they can't. Under silent running conditions, but the look they exchange says everything. They both have wives back in the States. Jones has a daughter he's never met, born while Tang was at sea. If the next depth charge pattern is accurate, that little girl will grow up never knowing her father. Lieutenant Savitkin leans close to O'Kane and whispers, "If they bracket us at this depth, skipper." "I know." O'Kane whispers back, "But we're below their standard depth charge settings. They'll have to guess where we are." It's a calculated gamble based on O'Kane's understanding of Japanese doctrine. Most destroyer captains set their depth charges for 150 to 250 feet because that's where American submarines typically operate. Some might set a few charges deeper, 300 or 350 feet, but setting charges for 400 feet or more requires manually adjusting each weapon's hydrostatic fuse. And that takes time. Time that a destroyer captain might not take in the heat of battle. Unless, of course, this particular Japanese captain is smarter than average. Wham! The first depth charge detonates 200 feet above them, the shockwave hitting the Tang like a hammer blow from God. But O'Kane was right. It's set too shallow. The explosion rocks the submarine, but doesn't damage her. Wham! A second charge, also shallow. Wham! A third. Then nothing. The destroyer's screws fade into the distance. The Japanese captain is moving off, probably believing he's lost contact or that his depth charge has finished the job. In the conning tower, O'Kane allows himself the smallest smile. His gamble paid off. But before anyone can celebrate, there's a new sound. Thrum, 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 thrum. A second destroyer, approaching fast from the port quarter. Second contact bearing 270. Caverly reports, his voice barely audible. Twin screws, making turns for 20 knots. He's coming in fast, Captain. O'Kane's mind races. This destroyer captain is hunting aggressively, probably coordinating with the first ship. If they're smart, if they're communicating by radio, the second destroyer might set his charges deeper based on a first ship's failure to get a kill. Take her to 500 feet, O'Kane says. The order lands like a physical blow. Lieutenant Savitkin's face goes white. "Sir, that's 100 feet beyond test depth. The hull wasn't designed." "I know what the hull was designed for, Larry." O'Kane interrupts, his voice still calm but edged with steel. "I also know that we're dead if we stay at this depth. Take her to 500 feet, now." Savitkin relays the order. Throughout the Tang, men hear the command and their blood runs cold. 500 feet. At that depth, the pressure will be nearly 217 pounds per square inch. The submarine will be subjected to forces that would crush her like a beer can under a boot heel. The depth gauge needle begins its descent again. 430 feet, 440 feet. At 450 feet, something gives way with a sharp crack that echoes through the boat. In the crew's mess, a coffee mug someone left on a table shatters spontaneously, unable to withstand the compression of the air inside the submarine. Men look at each other with wide eyes, wondering what else might break. 460 feet, 470 feet. The hull groans continuously now. A deep bass note that you feel in your chest more than hear. Rivets pop with sounds like gunshots. In the engine room, motor machinists mate. Hank Flanagan watches a trickle of water appear where there shouldn't be any water seeping through a microscopic fissure in the pressure hull. He grabs a wooden wedge and a mallet, moving quietly to plug the leak before it becomes a flood. 480 feet. The Tang's hull compresses inward by nearly 3 inches from its original diameter. The submarine's steel skin actually buckles in places, creating shallow dimples that weren't there before. In the control room, Chief Ballinger pumps carefully measured amounts of water from tank to tank, trying to keep the boat level while she descends into the abyss. 490 feet. O'Kane grips the periscope housing, his knuckles white. He's not a religious man. But right now, he's thinking about his wife, Ernestine, and their children back in California. He's thinking about the 86 men whose lives depend on his decision to go deeper than any American submarine has gone in combat. He's thinking about whether he's a brave commander or a reckless fool. The depth gauge touches 500 feet, and the needle stops moving. Chief Ballinger has achieved neutral buoyancy. The Tang hangs suspended in the darkness, 500 feet beneath the surface, her hull compressed, her crew silent, her fate uncertain. Thrum, 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 thrum. The second destroyer passes directly overhead, so close that the sound of its propellers seems to fill the entire submarine. Every man aboard listens, waiting for the telltale splash of depth charges entering the water. And then they hear it. Not a splash, but multiple splashes. Splash, 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 splash. 6 depth charges, a full pattern. And this Japanese captain has learned from his colleague's mistake. Brace for impact, O'Kane barks. The first depth charge detonates at 300 feet. Too shallow. The second explodes at 350 feet. Still too shallow. But the third. Wham! The explosion occurs at 450 feet, close enough that the Tang feels like she's been hit by a freight train. October 24th, 1944. 0451 hours. 500 feet beneath the Taiwan Strait. The depth charge that detonates at 450 feet is close enough to kill 50 feet above the Tang, maybe 100 yards to starboard. The shock wave hits the submarine broadside, and for a moment, every man aboard believes this is the end. The hull screams, metal tears. The submarine rolls 15 degrees to port, throwing men against bulkheads. In the galley, dishes cascade from their shelves. In the engine room, a high-pressure airline ruptures, releasing a shriek of compressed air that sounds like a dying animal. Chief Electrician's mate De Silva is thrown into the electrical panel he's monitoring. Blood streams from a gash above his eye, but he ignores it, his hands flying across the switches to prevent a short circuit that could start a fire. Fire in a submarine is worse than flooding. You can't escape smoke, can't open a window, can't breathe. Fire in a submarine 500 feet underwater is a death sentence. Wham! The fourth depth charge, closer still. The lights go out completely. Emergency lanterns cast red shadows that make everything look like a scene from hell. In the forward torpedo room, one of the massive Mark 18 torpedoes breaks loose from its storage rack and crashes to the deck with a sound like thunder. Chief Liebold and Torpedoman Jones dive for it, wrestling the 3,000-pound weapon back into place before it can roll and crush someone, or God forbid, arm itself. Wham! The fifth charge. This one detonates at 500 feet, the same depth as the Tang, perhaps 150 yards away. The pressure wave hits like a solid wall. A section of hull plating in the aft battery compartment buckles inward with a screech of tortured steel. Seawater sprays through a rupture in a pipe fitting. The temperature inside the submarine drops instantly as freezing ocean water mixes with the compressed air. Flooding in the aft battery compartment, someone shouts. O'Kane's face remains impassive, but his mind is calculating survival odds at lightning speed. The aft battery compartment is directly beneath the crew's quarters. If it floods completely, the submarine will become stern-heavy, pitching downward at 500 feet, Any loss of buoyancy control could send them plummeting into an uncontrolled dive. The Taiwan Strait is 600 feet deep in places. If they go past 600 feet, the hull will implode. Simple physics. Seal the aft battery. O'Kane orders. Pump from auxiliary. Maintain this depth. Easier said than done. Chief Ballinger is already working the trim manifold, pumping water forward to compensate for the flooding aft. But the submarine is getting heavier. The bow planes are angled up at maximum deflection just to keep them level. If the flooding continues, no amount of pumping will save them. Wham! The sixth depth charge, mercifully farther away. The pattern is complete. The destroyer above has expended its weapons. For 30 seconds, there's relative silence. Then the thrum, thrum, thrum of propeller screws, fading into the distance. The destroyer is moving off, either to reload depth charges or because its captain believes the Tang is finished. O'Kane waits. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. The only sounds are the groan of the hull under pressure, the hiss of the ruptured airline that someone is trying to isolate, and the steady drip, drip, drip of seawater from a dozen small leaks. At 5 minutes, O'Kane speaks. Damage report, all compartments. The reports come in, whispered from station to station. Forward torpedo room, operational. Minor leaks. Control room, pressure gauge destroyed. Depth gauge cracked but functional. Steering operational. Crew's quarters extensive damage. Bunks collapsed. Personal gear destroyed. Galley total loss. Forward battery compartment chlorine gas levels rising. 1 battery cracked. Aft battery compartment flooding controlled but not stopped. Engine room high-pressure airline ruptured. Hydraulic leak. 1 diesel engine damaged beyond immediate repair. Aft torpedo room operational. Lieutenant Savadkin summarizes quietly. We're hurt, skipper. We can still navigate and we can still shoot. But we're taking on water faster than we can pump it out. The chlorine gas in the forward battery is going to be a problem if we can't surface and ventilate. And we've lost maybe 20% of our compressed air reserves from that ruptured line. O'Kane nods. Compressed air is life aboard a submarine. You use it to blow ballast tanks when you surface, to fire torpedoes, to operate dozens of vital systems. Losing 20% of their air supply means losing options. How long can we stay submerged? O'Kane asks. At current CO2 levels and with the forward battery offline. Savadkin calculates mentally. Maybe 4 hours before the air becomes too toxic to breathe. Less if we have to maneuver and exert ourselves. 4 hours. O'Kane checks his watch. It's 0455 hours. Dawn will break around 0630. If they surface in darkness, they have a chance of escaping on the surface before the destroyers spot them. If they wait too long, they'll surface in daylight and be sitting ducks. But there's another problem. The destroyers above aren't going away. O'Kane can hear them through the hull, 2 distinct sets of propeller screws, circling like sharks, waiting for the Tang to show herself. The Japanese captains know their prey is wounded. They're patient. They'll wait. Secure from silent running. O'Kane orders. Maintain depth. All stations switch to battery power conservation. No unnecessary movement. No unnecessary power consumption. We're going to sit right here at 500 feet until those destroyers get bored and leave. It's a war of nerves now. The Japanese destroyers have depth charges left. They always carry reloads, but they're not dropping them randomly. They're conserving their weapons, listening, waiting for the Tang to make noise. And aboard the Tang, 87 men settle in for what submariners call the long wait sitting in damaged submarine. breathing poisoned air, hundreds of feet underwater, while enemy warships prowl above. In the crew's quarters, Radioman Caverly removes his sonar headphones and massages his temples. He's been listening to propeller screws for nearly an hour, and his head is pounding. Next to him, motor machinist Clayton Decker from Iowa sits on what's left of his bunk and pulls out a photograph. His wife and their farm in Cedar Rapids. He wonders if he'll ever see either again. In the wardroom, Lieutenant Murray Frezzi, the assistant engineering officer, calculates the remaining battery power. At their current consumption rate, they have perhaps 10 hours of power left. After that, every system will shut down: lights, pumps, air scrubbers, everything. They'll be dead in the water, blind and helpless. O'Kane remains in the conning tower, standing watch. He doesn't sit, doesn't rest. As captain, he feels responsible for every decision that brought them to this moment: the decision to attack the convoy, the decision to dive deep, the decision to go to 500 feet. If they survive, he'll be called a hero. If they die, he'll be called reckless. The line between the two is razor thin. At 0530 hours, something changes. The sound of propeller screws overhead begins to fade. One destroyer, then the second, moving away toward the southeast. The Japanese captains are giving up the hunt, either believing the Tang is destroyed or needing to return to port to reload depth charges. O'Kane waits another 30 minutes to be certain. Then, take her up to 300 feet. Slow rise. Minimum ballast tank blow. The Tang begins to ascend, her damaged hull creaking with every foot of decreased pressure. October 24th, 1944. 0612 hours. Rising from 300 feet. The USS Tang claws her way upward through the dark water like a wounded animal seeking air. At 300 feet, the hull stops groaning quite so loudly. At 250 feet, Chief Ballinger reports that the flooding in the aft battery compartment has slowed. The decreased pressure means the seawater isn't forcing its way through the cracks quite so aggressively. At 200 feet, men begin to breathe a little easier, though the air inside the submarine is thick with carbon dioxide, oil fumes, and the acrid tang of chlorine gas seeping from the forward battery. O'Kane raises the periscope at 65 feet, sweeping the horizon in the pre-dawn darkness. The sea is empty. The destroyers are gone. Their silhouettes disappeared over the horizon. To the west, the sky is beginning to lighten the false dawn that comes before true sunrise. They have perhaps 20 minutes of relative darkness left. Surface the boat. O'Kane orders. Lookouts to the bridge. Gun crews stand by. The Tang breaches the surface at 0618 hours. Seawater streaming from her conning tower and deck. The 4 diesel engines cough to life, and blessed fresh air begins to pour through the submarine's ventilation system. Men who've been breathing poison for nearly 3 hours gulp it down like drowning victims. In the forward battery compartment, damage control teams open hatches and use portable blowers to evacuate the chlorine gas before it can kill someone. O'Kane climbs to the bridge, binoculars in hand, scanning the horizon. The Taiwan Strait is empty, except for debris from the Japanese transport. They sank wooden planks, oil slicks, what might be a lifeboat floating in the distance. The other transport has escaped, along with the destroyers. But the Tang is alive, damaged but operational. Her crew intact except for minor injuries. Lieutenant Savadkin joins O'Kane on the bridge. His face is haggard, streaked with sweat and oil. But he's grinning. That was the goddamnedest thing I've ever been through. Skipper. 500 feet. I still can't believe the hull held. Mare Island builds good boats, O'Kane says simply. But there's something in his eyes of relief, perhaps, or the recognition of how close they came to dying. Get a full damage assessment. I want to know everything that's broken, everything that's questionable, and how long until we're combat effective again. Over the next 2 hours. As the Tang limps southward away from the Taiwan Strait, the damage reports come in. The list is sobering: 1 cracked battery, multiple hull leaks, a ruptured high-pressure airline, damaged electrical systems, destroyed pressure gauges, 1 diesel engine that needs a complete overhaul, flooding in the aft battery compartment, structural hull damage, including buckled plates and popped rivets, and 20% of their compressed air reserves lost. But she's still afloat, still capable of diving, though no one wants to test that capability right away. Still capable of fighting. O'Kane orders the crew to make temporary repairs, welding patches over cracks, plugging leaks with wooden wedges and oakum, isolating the damaged forward battery. By noon, the Tang is in marginally better shape, though she won't be diving to 500 feet again anytime soon. She won't be diving past 200 feet if O'Kane can help it. The question is, what now? They're damaged, deep in enemy-controlled waters, with enough fuel and torpedoes for perhaps 1 more engagement before they need to head for Pearl Harbor. Standard doctrine says to break off the patrol, head for friendly waters, get the boat repaired. But O'Kane isn't standard. That night, October 24th, the Tang encounters another Japanese convoy in the Formosa Strait. Despite his crew's exhaustion, despite the damage to his boat, O'Kane presses the attack. They sink 2 more transport ships, bringing the patrol total to 12 Japanese vessels destroyed. It's during this attack, firing their last 2 torpedoes, that disaster strikes. 1 torpedo malfunctions, circles back, and strikes the Tang herself. The submarine goes down in minutes. Of 87 men aboard, only 9 survive O'Kane and 8 crew members who were on the bridge or in the water when she sank. They're captured by the Japanese and spend the rest of the war as prisoners, enduring torture and starvation. 78 men die with the Tang chief Liebold, radio man Caverly, motor machinist Decker, Lieutenant Frazee, and 74 others. They die in the forward torpedo room, the engine room, the crew's quarters. Trapped inside a submarine that survived 500 feet of depth only to be destroyed by her own weapon. But the story of that mad dive to 500 feet becomes legend. When O'Kane returns from Japanese captivity in 1945, he's awarded the Medal of Honor not for sinking ships, but for leadership and tactical brilliance under extreme conditions. He tells the story of taking the Tang to crush depth and beyond, of gambling everything on the strength of American engineering and the courage of American sailors. The maneuver enters U.S. Navy submarine doctrine. After the war, submariners study O'Kane's decision-making, his willingness to exceed test depth to evade destruction. The Palau-class submarines, it turns out, were capable of diving much deeper than their official 400-foot test depth. Some post-war tests showed they could survive to 612 feet before hull failure. O'Kane couldn't have known that in October 1944, but he understood something more important, that sometimes the only way to survive is to do what the enemy thinks is impossible. Mare Island Naval Shipyard. Upon learning that the Tang survived dives to 500 feet, quietly increased the rated test depth of future submarines. Engineers went back and studied the construction techniques, the welding patterns, the steel composition that allowed O'Kane's boat to withstand such pressure. Those lessons informed the design of America's Cold War submarines, boats that would routinely operate at depths that would have seemed fantastical in 1944. The Tang herself rests in 180 feet of water off the coast of China, a war grave containing 78 American sailors. She's the most decorated submarine in U.S. Navy history, credited with sinking 33 Japanese ships totaling 454 tons. Her last patrol, the patrol that included the mad dive to 500 feet, accounted for 13 of those vessels. O'Kane lived until 1994, dying at age 83. He never stopped talking about his crew, the men who trusted him enough to follow him into the depths. He never claimed to be fearless. "Fear is a good thing," he said in one interview. "It keeps you sharp. What matters is what you do despite the fear." Those men stayed at their stations at 500 feet, knowing the hull might implode at any second. That's not the absence of fear. That's courage. In Submarine Force Headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia, there's a plaque commemorating the Tang and her crew. Beneath the ship's specifications and battle record, there's a single line from O'Kane's patrol report. "Took her to 500 feet. The hull held. The crew never wavered. We survived." It's the understatement of the Pacific War. Because surviving isn't just about staying alive, it's about making decisions in impossible circumstances, about trusting your equipment and your crew, about going deeper than anyone thought possible and coming back to tell the tale. Richard O'Kane and the men of the USS Tang did that on October 24, 1944, in the Taiwan Strait. At a depth where submarines weren't supposed to survive. They went to 500 feet, the devil's depths, and they came back, at least for one more day.